drawing attention to that. Okay, in no particular order, our panelists are Professor Mojúbàolú Olufúnké Okome, who is the Tao Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College, CUNY. She's also on the Council of Foreign Relations Distinguished Higher Education Ambassador since 2024, and a Lagos Studies Association Distinguished Scholar. She's a two-time Carnegie Diaspora Fellow, a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious Diversity. And she was also named one of Nigeria's annual 100 Leading Women in 2023. She's an international political economist specializing in Africa with Nigeria as her country focus. And she's also the author or editor of 7 books, including A Sapped Democracy. She's a founder and editor of Irin Kerindo, a journal of African migration, as well as being the co-founder of #BringBackOurGirls NYC. The next panelist that I want to introduce is Professor Moses Ochonu. Professor Ochonu is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in History and Professor of African History at Vanderbilt University. He's the author and editor of 5 books, including Emirs in London, Subaltern Travel, and Nigeria's Modernity, which came out in 2022. His current book project is entitled Boko Haram, The Past of the Present Upheaval, and this will be published by the University of California Press. His op-eds and essays have been published in Time magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, the Tennessean, African Arguments, Africa as a Country, The Guardian, and many other publications besides. Next, we have Professor Oghenetoja Okoh, who is an associate professor of African history and the director of the African and African American Studies program at Loyola University in Maryland. Her research focuses on minority identity and citizenship in 20th century Nigeria. Her book, Minority Identities in Nigeria, Contesting and Claiming Citizenship in the 20th Century, has been published by Cambridge University Press and traces how minority communities in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria became marginalized over the first half of the course of the 20th century, and also how they leveraged their political status to seek recognition and inclusion in Nigerian politics on the eve of independence and beyond. Her current research focuses on Nigerian transnational migration and its historical impact on Nigerian social and cultural expectations from the post-war period to the present. Last but not least, we have Dr. Modupe Oshikoya. Dr. Oshikoya is an associate professor of political science at Virginia Wesleyan University. She received her PhD in global governance and human security from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her dissertation won the APCG Lynn Reiner Best Dissertation in African Politics in 2019, and it explored the dynamics of military violence in conflict zones in Nigeria, with a particular focus on the intersection of institutional practices and civilian impacts. Her field research involved extensive on-the-ground embedded research, conducting interviews with military personnel, local leaders, and survivors of violence. And this work provided critical insights into the practice of gender-based violence and the socio-political conditions that enable or mitigate its occurrence. Her book, Military Gender-Based Violence in Nigeria, Civilian Abuse in Conflict Zones, will be published by Edinburgh Press this year. And she's published several scholarly articles, book chapters, policy reports, etc., in her previous role, working with the House of Commons and producing research briefings on international affairs. So I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining us and for the light you are going to shed on the historical and regional context of Trump's Christmas bombings in Nigeria. Most people on this, joining this conversation, will already know what we're talking about, but there are some students in the audience for whom this might be some new information. So I will just very, very briefly recap the events we're here to discuss. In November, at the beginning of November, November 1st, 2025, President Donald Trump of the United States threatened U.S. military intervention in Nigeria, announced the threat of U.S. military intervention in Nigeria, citing the need to protect Christians from religiously targeted attacks. And these threats were met with a lot of outcry from civil society groups in the US, in Nigeria, and elsewhere. In early December 2025, there were a spate of episodes of insecurity, kidnappings, and sporadic attacks by bandits, which was continuous with a pattern from earlier in the year of 2025 and even before, and in various parts of the country. But on Christmas Day, December 25th, the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, under the direction of Trump, conducted airstrikes launched from the Gulf of Guinea onto northwest Nigeria, particularly Sokoto State. At the same time, Trump announced on social media that this Christmas present of the airstrikes was to stop the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria. Also announced on social media was that only bandits were struck and that the U.S. Had not hit any civilian casualties. A couple of days later, the Nigerian government also put out statements affirming that this bombing strike was actually a joint national effort between the two countries, the US and Nigeria. But they rejected and specifically critiqued the narrative that Christians in Nigeria had been especially targeted for violence, while insisting that both Muslim and Christian communities had been affected by extremist violence. So this is the Christmas bombing in question, the Christmas bombing episode that we're here to discuss. As you can see from this description, there are various histories that are implicated. One, histories of insecurity in the region, both the region of Nigeria, the region of northern Nigeria, and we can even say in West Africa in general. There are also histories of religious difference and perhaps minoritization of groups in Nigeria that may run along religious lines, but also along cultural and ethnic lines. And there are histories of Nigerian military that are implicated in this story, including its relationship with foreign militaries like the US military. So I want to start with maybe asking our panelists to reflect on some of these more historical dimensions. But before I get to our questions, I know that this is a dynamic story. This is a dynamic story that is continually changing. There are new dimensions to it that are continually unfolding. So I just want to give each of our panelists a moment to offer some preliminary remarks on what is top of mind for you at this moment regarding this particular episode of the 2025 Christmas bombings in Nigeria. Let's start with Professor Okome.
Well, thank you very much. We've heard from you what, thank you for inviting me. We've heard what happened on Christmas Day last year, that the US had strikes in northwest Nigeria. I can't say that I know exactly, comprehensively, and in a very objective way what happened, because we have not so far heard any serious report from either the US government or the Nigerian government. And I have to say, I am more disappointed with the Nigerian government. The statements that the Nigerian government put out were by the Minister for Foreign Affairs and some of the presidential aides, whom I'm not really clear about. But, I also have to say that I know that Nigerian Christians are the ones claiming a genocide. Some Nigerian Christians are claiming that a genocide is happening. And not only did they appeal to the Trump administration for help, they also were very happy about this strike, which I find to be shocking. Because in my own estimation, the killings in Nigeria did not just start happening. And we have to look to the beginning of Boko Haram's brutal attacks on people in northern Nigeria and some of the Nigerian neighbors in West Africa, including our Central African neighbor, Cameroon. So it's very surprising to me that that is not factored into what people are saying about the killings. So for me, Christians, Muslims, and people, frankly, who probably don't have any religious affiliation have been killed in numbers that are shocking enough that we should all be concerned. Now, the strikes were made, and apparently they didn't go to where people said things are really this hotspot now, which is around Plateau, Benue State, in central Nigeria. Instead, the report said that there was a strike at Jabo. Jabo is a location in Sokoto, I think. Mm-hmm. There were also the ordinance that was scattered as far as Kwara State, and some people are saying even in Niger. So this was supposed to be a blow against ISIS. There had been no prior ISIS presence reported in that area, and the targeting and purpose is very questionable. Also, we have a very complex security situation in Nigeria. People have, labeled this banditry. Let's remember there was Boko Haram, and then people said there were bandits, there were farmers and herder conflicts, and also militants who were very active in parts of northern Nigeria at different points in time. Mm-hmm. Plus, we have also in the south other, actions that are attributed to bandits and kidnappers and so forth. So the debris that fell on civilian areas. Nobody has said anything about casualties. So I see three things. There's a religious framing, and US evangelicals love this because for them, there's a Christian genocide, and they should jump on this and help to save their Christian brethren and sisterin. There's also, I can talk more about this later. The second framing is post-colonial sovereignty and intervention in the Sahel. There are Nigerians who say sovereignty doesn't matter. I think it is crucial to this matter. And I think Nigerians should be highly alarmed because this constitutes an external security intervention in our country and our region. And there's a war on terror logic that's driving it. And a rhetoric about the Sahel region is unstable. And so the US needs to be our policeman there to help to rescue us from ourselves. Now, what does it mean to have sovereignty, being independent and so forth is in question here. I also want to talk about the third thing. There's American domestic politics and how it's now shaping our African realities. The US itself has election cycles, advocacy networks, and media narratives that make it attractive for Americans to be talking about what's happening in Nigeria in these terms. I think this is a match made in heaven between the US actors and Nigerian Christians who want to frame things this way, knowing that this is what is going to get action from the US. Now, we also have to, anything that happens in Nigeria should foreground Nigerians and the Nigerian government, which seems to be missing in action here. And it is really, for me, abominable for there to be a government in a country and they haven't even said anything about any of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So maybe let's go next to, thank you so much for all of those reflections. Let's go next to Dr. Ochonu for your remarks on what is top of mind at this moment as you're thinking about this unfolding story on the Christmas bombings. Okay, for some reason the audio is not coming through. Although you were unmuted, now you are muted again.
How about now? Okay. All right, thank you for this invite. I'm going to introduce a few new angles.
Okay.
I appreciate the angle that has been put on the table by Professor Okome. And let me just introduce a few new angles for us to consider. One of them is that in addition to the pressure from the US evangelicals on Trump to do something about what they regard as a Christian genocide in Nigeria, they've also been some existential anxieties that have been percolating in the areas of the Middle Belt, one of the epicenters of the crisis, where people have been desperately calling on their government to protect them, and the government has failed to do so. So that has been a legitimate pressure that has come out of the Middle Belt, and that have been strategically also directed towards US evangelicals in this frame of Christian solidarity. So the internationalization of the crisis is definitely a factor. But let's also not forget that it is not just US Nigerian Christians that have also indicted the government's failure to protect citizens and have called on external actors to intervene. The governor of Borno State, Babagana Zulum, has been calling on the Nigerian government to recruit mercenaries, foreign mercenaries specifically, to intervene in the Northeast so that they can deal a decisive blow on Boko Haram and ISWAP in the Mandara Mountains and the Lake Chad areas where these groups have their strongholds. And he often invokes the 2014, I believe, example of President Jonathan, when Jonathan recruited South African mercenaries, and that intervention proved decisive in dealing with Boko Haram before Buhari took over and sent the mercenaries away. Also recently, the senator representing Borno South, Senator Ali Ndume, also called on the US to extend the bombing, which, if you were shocked, Professor Okome, this is even more shocking. If you were shocked that Christians have been welcoming this, the senator representing Borno South, also one of the most affected areas when it comes to Boko Haram violence, publicly called upon the US to extend the bombing to his area, his senatorial constituency, because he claims that the government of Nigeria has failed to protect his people and that the US should consider doing that. So my point being that there has been a groundswell of pressure on the US from not just Christians in the Middle Belt, not just Christians in Nigeria, but also from frustrated Muslims who themselves are victims. Some would even say they are bigger victims of some of this violence. So the pressure has been mounting, and of course it raises a question of sovereignty. But quite frankly, a lot of the people who make these calls consider sovereignty a secondary consideration. The other thing is that there's been since Tinubu took over, there's been a redirection of government anti-terrorism or anti-insurgency policy towards what they call the non-kinetic approach. Basically, making peace deals with terrorist groups, the Lakurawa, the ISWAP, the Boko Haram, the bandits, and so on. Sometimes even compelling communities to enter into these peace accords, as they call them. These peace accords do not require the terrorists to give up their weapons. They get to keep their weapons. They get to keep their capacity to also to still continue with their violence. And the terms of the peace deals are quite unpalatable. And the bandits and the terrorists continue to wreak havoc. So people have been frustrated by this non-kinetic approach that have allowed the violence to grow and to fester and to escalate. So that is another background. That's another factor that we should consider. The last thing I'm going to talk about is an intersection, what I see as an intersection between the imperative of regime survival on the Nigerian side and Donald Trump's need to impress his evangelical base and to demonstrate his strong man bona fides and credential, right? So there's been this curious intersection of these two imperatives on both sides of the Atlantic. On the side of Tinubu, he wants to obviously survive politically, so he wants to get Trump off his back. He thinks that the way to do that is to cooperate, to allow these strikes, these bombings to occur. If the Americans want to bomb for symbolic reasons, for other strategic reasons, let them do it so that they can back off my administration. On Donald Trump's side, he wants obviously to impress his evangelical base who care about this narrative of Christian genocide. He also wants to be seen as somebody who is a strong man who can make a threat and back it up. So you see a win-win situation develop where each side can get what they want. Donald Trump can get his talking points, his evangelicals can get their talking points, and Tinubu can also get some respite. And so that's what I see as the basis for these strikes. And finally, a strike can accomplish multiple purposes. From the US perspective, maybe it also sends a message to China. China has been expanding their economic investments in Nigeria of late. They've recently funded 2 lithium processing and mining operations. I think one is in Nasarawa State. Another one is opening later this year, I believe in maybe Lagos State. These are massive investments in earth minerals. The US cares about that. And the US probably is sending a message. These strikes were a one-off. They haven't been followed up by other US strikes. So it makes me believe that this was a symbolic message to China as well. And having been kicked out of Niger Republic, their large, expansive base in Niger Republic, they used to have this base. The military took over in Niger and kicked them out. Now they conduct most of their Sahelian operations from Ghana, which is not ideal geographically. So ideally, they want a base somewhere near the Sahel. Nigeria is closer to the Sahel. Nigeria is a more ideal location for them to site a base or to have a base of operation. So I think they are looking for all of these things, and the bombing should be framed and understood within this broad context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. You anticipated some of the things that we're going to talk about. But let's go to one of the issues that you raised about, the longer history of particular regions in the central region having a long history of insecurity, aggression, to the point at which their governors are now directly inviting intervention from the US, bypassing the Nigerian government. And in those regions, we also have long histories of kind of entrenched political minoritization, right? And the mobilization of various kinds of identities to secure political access and political power. So maybe, Toja, we can ask you, Professor Okoh, to talk a bit about what's front of mind for you when you're thinking about the ways in which these dynamics may be affected by ideas of minoritization.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me participate. And I also want to thank Dr. Okome and Ochonu for laying out all of the sort of larger, bigger picture questions and the strategic questions. For me, thinking about primarily the relationship between the communities that were directly affected by the bombings, and thinking about their location, not just in terms of their literal geography, but their location within the sort of political infrastructure of Nigeria and where they sit. Um, it strikes me as, again, it has to be a strategic issue, given that in that part of Nigeria, there's very little in terms of immediate gain for the United States, right? On top of that, putting this into larger context and thinking about these agricultural communities in sort of these marginal parts of Nigeria very much mimic some of the other communities in the Middle Belt as well as in the Delta, where you have security issues are very much tied with resources and either a wealth of resources or a lack of resources, right? And in many cases, Boko Haram and these various organizations, these organized groups, prey on the sort of lack of development and, quite frankly, sort of a neglect by the government, the federal government, to support and protect these communities on the ground. Poverty is a big problem, especially in these pockets in the north, as well as land resources. We rarely talk about climate change, but climate change is also another point of pressure on these communities in terms of land disputes and things like that. So compounding the question of strategic interest are very immediate local interests in terms of access to resources, making their livelihood, and who is protecting them. Nigeria has had a very long history of first protecting the interests of the sort of extraction economies that operate in Nigeria, before even addressing the relationship between itself and its citizens. And I do think that this is part of that longer history that we have seen in Nigeria in terms of the sort of weak relationship between Nigeria and its civil society, which I hope we can talk more about.
Thank you so much. I mean, one of the key actors that is charged with protecting citizens or protecting the nation is the military. So, Professor Oshikoya, can you talk about what is, front of mind for you when thinking about the Nigerian military's role in this episode? In some ways, they've been marginalized, but they also have a longer history of collaboration with the US. So, what has that history yielded us? Has it yielded greater capacity or a kind of forms of dependency upon the US? Like, can you speak to that?
Hello, good afternoon. And I want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for my fellow panelists for putting this broad perspective on the Christmas Day bombings. So for me, the fact that the US carried out these strikes, it actually treats a domestic security issue or domestic challenge and raised it into an international security issue. So it actually raises questions about counterterrorism effectiveness and the state capacity of Nigeria, as well as regional stability. So the fact that US-Nigeria counterterrorism cooperation has been a relationship that has been pretty much foregrounded because of the Boko Haram terrorism that has plagued Nigeria. It really does demonstrate a continued international engagement in Nigeria. But it also highlights that there is a fragmented threat environment driven by the insurgency, not only in the northeast, but banditry in the northwest, and then communal conflict in the north central region. But because these threats are concentrated in northern Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim majority, most of the victims of violence are Muslim. So the fact that the President Donald Trump decided to bomb Nigeria to save persecuted Muslims, it doesn't fit the framing of the reality on the ground. But what I think is essential to note is that we need to look at the different types of security issues that Nigeria is currently facing, because violence is not monolithic. In the northeast, there's the long-running Boko Haram and ISWAP insurgency, and the new insurgency that was declared late last year, but the La Coruna, I think that's how you pronounce it. And my apologies if it's not correct. Mm-hmm. And then, but in the northwest, where in Sokoto state and surrounding states, it's more banditry. So it's more criminal economies that are literally driving the governance in those areas, because the state has either pulled back or the security forces are not in those areas. And this has left gaps, especially governance gaps that are claiming lives and territory. And then, of course, the herder-farmer conflict in the central region, mainly a lot in Plateau State, they have taken on a more increasingly communal dimension, even though outsiders view it as a more religious tension. Mainly these forms of violence, because they are predominantly in the north, it is overlooked by international audiences that Muslims are actually also at risk and also victims too. But I think for me, the one thing that really came when I remember listening to the news on Christmas Day and thinking to myself how it has been framed internationally. The fact that the security in Nigeria is framed as a religious security issue rather than these different fragmented violence across the board, and the fact that it's been interpreted through a religious persecution lens, in particular, specifically focusing on Christian victimhood, really elevates this issue to an existential threat. And the fact that it was brought up in the United Nations last year in November by the US Secretary to the UN, really does show that in essence, that they are trying to show that the persecution of Christians is an existential threat to the point where it needs external intervention, that the Nigerian government cannot deal with this issue. And therefore, it is something that we all need to focus on. But in essence, from a military perspective, airstrikes can be tactically effective. Whether they were effective is something that we will see in the future. But to be frank, it's a limited strategy, especially where most of the armed groups are embedded within the civilian population and they exploit local grievances. So because of this, we can see that security cannot be separated from Nigeria's broader conditions of vulnerability. So we need to look at the humanitarian stress that is currently happening in Nigeria regarding food insecurity, displacement, and also a lack of basic services. So this reduces civilian resilience and increases their susceptibility to coercion by armed groups. And because of this, in this context, insecurity and vulnerability reinforce one another in a self-perpetuating cycle. And so, for me, the core security challenge that arose out of the Christmas Day bombings is not whether or not force is used, but whether or not military action, the political framing, and what happens next, the stabilization efforts, whether or not they're all aligned with the complex realities of Nigeria's conflict landscape. because without that alignment, no matter what intervention occurs, it's not going to address the root drivers of insecurity. So I'll leave it there for now. I have much more to say.
Thank you so much. As we can see, this is a deeply complex issue, and a few things that have come out are the question of the question of the various actors in this episode, right, and what they have to gain. Professor Ochonu started by talking about there seeming to be a mutual benefit to this episode from a kind of a U.S. domestic narrative standpoint for an administration that may be cultivating support from an evangelical interest group. And also, maybe the Tinubu government seeks to kind of evade a direct conflict by allowing this limited bombing. And Professor Okome also talked about this kind of match made in heaven between interest groups both within Nigeria and the U.S. that have for their own various reasons are supporting this kind of a military aggression. And one of the things that I think about is, what other interest groups are there besides these nation states that we're focused on? We have talked a little bit about, local communities, states that have been dealing with insecurity and violence, seemingly without sufficient national support. They are interest groups. What about the communities that are directly affected by these bombings, by these interventions? They also are interest groups. Where are they faring? How do we think about their interests now that we're a month into the future, some time has passed, right? How are their interests reflected here? What might be the most kind of productive ways of proceeding while centering the interests of actual citizens on the ground? But related to that, some of you have already brought up the question of interests, not just in the territories that have been affected in the Northwest or in Nigeria, but maybe even interests in the region. What kinds of interests has the region of West Africa attracting that may explain some of the timing and the motivation behind these Christmas bombings as well? So maybe hyperlocal interests, but also kind of interest in a different way. What kind of interest is West Africa attracting, and how is Nigeria being implicated in it? Maybe we can continue with the same line.
I think it's important to also, and this has been mentioned by some of my fellow panelists, to remember China, Professor Ochonu. China has invested in Nigeria. It has invested in not only evacuating the rare earth minerals, but it's investing in processing them in Nigeria, in line with Nigerian desire for value-added local content, to whatever is being produced before it's carried out of the country. There's also the Sahelian neighbors of Nigeria, where there have been coups. Burkina Faso has captured a lot of, especially young people's imagination as a place that is anti-imperialist, where the French have been thrown out. They're not doing any deals with the Americans. I think our neighboring countries like, Niger and Chad and even Mali are also in this mix. Remember the AES countries have left ECOWAS, and that was really not managed very well. They are also critical actors here. And I think in terms of the rare earth element of this whole wahala, that, the US is highly interested. I have heard that Israel is also interested. China is interested. And many American businesses would like to snatch away whatever it is that China has initiated, so that the majority gain is on the American side. So, the whole jostling for the rare earth minerals and a whole lot of the machinations that are going on has made many people say maybe there's a new scramble for Africa. And as usual, Africans are not the kingpins in this. Africans are not going to gain the most from this. And the local people, you talked about what's happening in the communities. It's like nobody cares. There's been ordinance, there's been all these military waste in these communities. Has anybody bothered to go see what, are there chemicals that have been released and then people are hungry, we have we have some of the youngest population in the world in Africa. A lot of young people are in dire straits. They're unemployed. In this area, a lot of the social and economic statistics are the worst when you look at outcomes for human beings and how they live their lives. So human security is very important, but it is always shoved aside as inconsequential. And we're going to pay the price for it, because as far as I'm concerned, we will not have a de-escalation of conflict, because a lot of the very fundamental reasons why this crisis are happening and escalating are still very much with us. And, the Nigerian government, for all the non-kinetic whatever it's doing, is not really addressing the problem of poverty. The percentage of Nigerians, or the number of Nigerians that are multidimensionally poor, has actually increased to like over 140 million people. So we are not addressing these issues as it concerns ordinary people. For me, I think African governments, and let me just be specific, the Nigerian government, acts as if national security is about the personal security of the big, important men in charge, and not about the security of citizens.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I mean, in some ways, it has been argued that it's specifically that problem that has inspired some citizens to seek external backup, external intervention. And there also seems to be a tremendous debate about whether or not this kind of strike does have a productive impact on the security impasses, or whether it is simply compounding insecurity. So if anyone else wants to speak to these questions, please jump in.
I think Dr. Oshikoya's very astute observation and analysis linking insecurity with vulnerability really is at the heart of this, bringing the local to the national, right? I think when people are unable to meet their basic needs, it does make them increasingly vulnerable and really kind of like sitting ducks, like for these sort of banditry, activity. And at the same time, those who would participate in these activities, criminal activities, are themselves insecure. And so again, there is a vicious cycle on the ground that is fueling this. And we see this not just in northwestern Nigeria, but in all of these spaces where insecurity is intense. we see this lack, this vulnerability in terms of local populations vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis any kind of state government, much less national government. And so there is this kind of incapacity. Part of the historical problem is that the Nigerian government has never seriously built any capacity to manage this sort of infrastructural needs of these communities, much less built capacity, even military capacity to actually do this in a consistent way. So a one-off strike is definitely not going to be as productive as some kind of consistent presence that is there to protect in the interest of the local population rather than in the interest of the Nigerian government to protect its image or, make it seem that they are active in these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, I would like to come at this. I would like to underscore the point that have been made by Professor Oshikoya and Okoh about the importance of centering local actors and local grievances in this discussion. But I'd like to come at it from a slightly different angle, which is to say that, the religious framing, while problematic in all sorts of ways, retains a certain legitimate utility, I should say, because, for better or for worse, the crisis, as far as northern Nigeria is concerned, southern Nigeria is governed by different sort of dynamics. But as far as northern Nigeria is concerned, I always say that religion is the primary idiom of identity in northern Nigeria. That is not true for southern Nigeria. And so when people are victimized, both the victimhood and the violence are seen and are interpreted from religious lenses. And there is some historical legitimacy to that, because religion, again, is the primary ways in which the people identify themselves. And in the particular case of the multi-dimensional violence that is racking northern Nigeria, from the northeast to the northwest to the north central, you have bandits, you have Lakurawa, the ISIS-affiliated Lakurawa. This is a new phenomenon. You have Boko Haram and ISWAP in the northeast, and then you have all these other groups of terrorists in the north central. In all these cases, the majority of the perpetrators, at least as of today, happen to be Muslims. There's no question about that. That's a fact. And, in the North Central in particular, the majority of the victims happen to be Christians or majority Christian communities. And so in a region where religion is already fraught historically, religion is already at the center of identity formation and identification, it is almost inevitable that the crisis will be interpreted by local people. Forget evangelicals for a moment, forget Donald Trump for a moment, by the local people themselves as a religious phenomenon. And this is not the first time either. Religion has always been at the center of any kind of local interpretations of violence in Nigeria since the 80s, I would say. There's a whole literature around that. So I want to, while we critique the religious framing, I want us to, again, at the same time, accord it the place that it deserves historically in northern Nigeria. It's not without basis. That said, I would like to pivot to something much broader, which is this idea that there's a history also in northern Nigeria, but also throughout Nigeria, of minority groups, people who feel marginalized, people who have minority status, people who have one grievance or the other, whether we're talking about IPOB in the southeast, or Niger Delta militants in the south-south, or Middle Belt people in the north central. All of these people somehow at different times felt themselves marginalized and sort of displaced from Nigerian politics or the Nigerian political economy, or have been victims of violence that they see as targeted towards their group. I always say that in the Northeast, for instance, Christians are targeted for being Christians. And that means something. We cannot just write that off. They are targeted simply for being Christians, for the way that they worship. The Muslims are targeted in that region because the extremists see them as insufficiently Muslim or Muslims who don't support their cause. That's a big difference that has to be acknowledged. That means something. So in other words, but the bigger point I'm trying to make is that there's a history of marginalized or aggrieved groups appealing to external actors in the face of the failure of the Nigerian state to protect them and to provide them the kinds of belonging and assurances that they need as citizens of a nation that claims to work for the interests of everyone. So it is this feeling of not being part of the state institutions, not being accepted as equals within the state project, sometimes that breeds this tendency to look outside for help to the superpower. You either appeal to America or to Russia or to China, or whoever you think can help you. So there's a feeling of the state doesn't care about me. The state doesn't protect me. The state has failed to do all of these things that states typically do in the social contract. And so we shouldn't lose sight of, number one, state failure as a catalyst for these types of narratives emerging and festering. We shouldn't also lose sight of how people articulate their victimhood. There's some legitimacy to it. You can't tell people how to cry when they are being systematically killed. You can't tell people how to narrate or how to frame their victimhood, especially when there's a historical basis for it, as there is in northern Nigeria. So the local angle is important for this reason as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciated that you pointed out that, that there is this history of religious targeting in the Northeast and as well as in North Central, which raises again the question that so many have about how did the Northwest region where Sokoto is located get pulled into this larger narrative? Is there a kind of a conflation of the North in general that we see happening through this episode and the narrating of this episode? And then the other thing that I was thinking of is that, that it's important for us. One of the things I think is important is that the the flip side of the narrative of Christian persecution is Islamic terrorism, right? So there's a kind of way in one of the contexts that I think that we're still in is the context of global Islamophobia. And so how is that being mobilized in the support for these interventions into Nigeria? And that's something for us to think about. And how will that affect Nigerians ultimately when the global community turns to the next thing? And I think that the excuse me. So one thing that's clear from our conversation is that not only is the North not homogeneous in terms of how conflicts are playing out and the lines of division, but Nigeria is not homogeneous in terms of how Nigerians are understanding this episode, how they are responding to this episode. So what are some of the factors that you see as really explaining this range of viewpoints on what the crucial issues are? Are the crucial issues sovereignty? Sovereignty? Is the crucial issue, communal insecurity? Is the crucial issue minerals and the kind of a global war for resources? What explains really, how do you think about the range of positions that we're seeing emerging among Nigerian voices about how to think about this episode?
Well, yeah, Professor Oshikoya.
Oh, no, please.
No, I think I'd really enjoy hearing your perspective.
Oh, well, I think when I first started looking at the reaction to the bombings, Vanguard and the Guardian in Nigeria and different newspapers and online forums, a lot of people either expressed joy at the American airstrikes, or they were like, so what? Which was interesting. A lot of people turned around, for people who expressed joy, they turned around and said that America needs to strike more. There needs to be more strikes on more terrorist strongholds, and they actually need to actually come into Nigeria, have troops on the ground to stop the insecurity in some regions, because they believe that the Nigerian government is not capable of doing that for them, which really does speak to a lack of trust in the Nigerian government in terms of the security arrangements that they provide for their citizens. But that lack of trust has always, in essence, I think, has been there, but it's now become internationalized. Now people from other countries, i.e. from the global north countries, are looking at Nigeria in a way that they cannot protect certain minority groups within, or minority majority groups within their borders. But it really does smack of a structural risk to stability within the region as well. Maybe, I don't know, for me, I think it was the reason that America decided to strike in northwest Nigeria is probably because they did conflate North Nigeria with like the Boko Haram insurgency with all of North Nigeria. But I think it definitely was a message to China, because Nigeria is central to China's economic and strategic footprint in Africa. And so if America can perhaps potentially show China or demonstrate to China that they can engage militarily, then it may make China take a step back from engaging in Nigeria, but also other African countries as well. And the fact that there has been the breakaway from ECOWAS regarding Nigeria's allies in the region, that could also be tied into this narrative as well, and the strikes. But it really does strike, I think, at the lack of sovereignty, despite the Nigerian government coming out and saying that the strikes were in coordination with them. So it is for me, I find it, I think that it's an evolving situation that we need to continue to monitor.
Sorry, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I think to come back to this question of, why do we see such a range of viewpoints? There is no coherent Nigerian position on this episode, and what should the audience be understanding about the strength of the range of disagreements and what it makes possible really for international actors in Nigeria?
There's never been a unified Nigerian perspective on whether we even need to have one country, what language should be our lingua franca, a whole host of things. And I think that the insecurity in Nigeria is not a new thing. And there are different hotspots where it is very intense. And, people in those places have always felt abandoned by the governments, the various administrations in Nigeria.
Yes.
And, appeals to government to come rescue you, to put systems in place that defend communities are ignored most of the time, So, and at the same time, you have also actions by Nigerian government that cooperates with these extractivist actors to visit violence upon Nigerian communities. You saw this in the Niger Delta, you know, with the Obasanjo administration. So, you know, it goes beyond lack of trust between Nigerians and the state. Nigerians expect the state to be absent, and they engage in all manner of self-help to protect themselves, which is why you have had the proliferation and strengthening of a whole lot of ethnic militia that are very well armed and sometimes even better armed than state security forces.
Mhm.
So, you know, I used to say that Nigeria has a fragile state, you know, because I wanted to be kind. I'm a Nigerian. I don't want to assert the failed state rhetoric. But Nigeria acts as if it's a failed state. It does not show concern for fulfilling what should be a serious constitutional mandate of protecting the citizens and inhabitants of the territory over which you say you have control. You know, so another appalling thing to me is that even Nigerian state authorities hire ethnic militia, and they hire what do you call those international ones? The mercenaries to come protect them. And paradoxically, Nigeria was able to go to Liberia, to go to Sierra Leone, and also engage in stopping a coup that was underway in the Republic of Benin. So this is a very mixed up situation where it doesn't seem as if the custodians of the state really care about, number one, sovereignty, about number two, their constitutional obligations, and three, you know, the well-being of citizens beyond their narrow circle of cronies.
But this is a condition, this is a post-colonial condition that is not necessarily unique to Nigeria. I think it feels and looks much more complicated in a place like Nigeria, given its ethnic, religious, social complexity, right? And its political complexity. These are crises of governance, right? It's not just a crisis of sovereignty, it's a crisis of governance, one that Nigeria has not been able to fully exercise since its inception. I mean, it is a gatekeeper state, to borrow from our esteemed Fred Cooper, right? This is a gatekeeping state. It is about managing interests as opposed to governing and supporting its citizens. And it has always been set up in that manner. It is set up to protect the extractive industries first, and then to support the elites who support those extractive industries, and then maybe protect those people who are at least locally sort of occupying those spaces, those ports, those spaces where extraction is occurring. Outside of that, there's nothing, right? And so this is a historical problem, but it is also an existential, sort of a historically structural problem in the post-colonial condition, as part of a post-colonial condition. It's not a Nigerian problem specifically in some ways, and Nigeria actually provides a special case in terms of the complexity of the problem and the kinds of issues that arise, as well as those opportunities, right? I do think that the rise or the reinforcement, if you will, of ethnic associations and various kinds of mutual aid societies in conjunction with ethnic militias and et cetera, all arise from the lack of, direct relationship with the state.
And I love. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I just wanted to say a few things to reinforce what the way that Professor Okome framed it, which is this, the elites, the political elites themselves are the supreme violators of Nigerian sovereignty,
Yes.
even more so than the citizens. We tend to go after the lowest hanging fruit, the most vulnerable people, the people doing, Professor Oshikoya, the people who were celebrating the strikes, the people who were saying positive things, about the Americans and asking them to come and to invade. And, we tend to, see those people as naive. We go after them. But to be honest, first of all, sovereignty is an intellectual construct that matters more to intellectuals like us than to regular people. But number two, the biggest violators of Nigerian sovereignty are the political elite, just like Professor Okome said. They are the ones who do not invest in local institutions, in hospitals, and they're the ones who run abroad to seek treatment. They're the ones who go abroad to seek foreign validation for anything that they do. They are the ones who ignore local expertise and instead cultivate foreign expertise for every little project, right? They are the ones who engage in all of these activities. So I think we need to place blame where it lies. The people, the regular people who celebrate the strikes, who are asking the Americans, they're acting out of desperation. Kind of positive celebratory reception to external intervention on the part of the regular people. And you know what? I've lived long enough to to see different kinds of groups, Niger Delta people groups, Yoruba separatists, Middle Belt Christian groups, IPOB in the Southeast, at different times embrace and actively call for external intervention. It means that our aspirations differ and our aspirations change from time to time. A group that calls for an external and celebrates an external intervention today might tomorrow oppose it. Just like we see, that explains, I mean, your question, Professor George, about the differing reactions. That explains the fragmented reactions. It's head scratching. Some people are celebrating, some people are decrying it, some people in the north, the Muslims it's like, no, we don't agree with this narrative, and why are you bombing us, and this and that. So I think that just goes to show that we have fragmented interests and aspirations. I recall in 2014, something significant happened. And I think that might have been a game changer, even though it went unnoticed. A group of 10 northern Nigerian governors from the opposition traveled to Washington, D.C. I think at the invitation of the Obama State Department. And they went there and accused President Jonathan of being the sponsor of Boko Haram. I don't know if we all remember that. And explicitly asked the State Department and the Obama administration to intervene, not to intervene against the terrorists, but to intervene to help remove Jonathan from power. So at that time, external intervention, even an invasion, served their political interest, or so they thought. So they were willing to put all of their political capital, as controversial and as sovereignty threatening as it was at the time. They were willing to engage in those kinds of, it bordered on subversive activity, what they were doing. But they were willing to do that. But right now, those same people are the ones saying, well, this Christian narrative is nonsense and we shouldn't be inviting the Americans and this and that and that. And so I think it's all because we don't share the same ideals, we have different aspirations, our political alliances and interests shift from time to time, and that tends to color our reactions to some of these things. But for the local people on the ground who are desperate, a lot of these discussions fly over their head because they want to be protected. They want the violence to end. They simply want peace in their communities so that they can go about their regular activities and thrive and look for human flourishing like everybody else in the world.
I want to thank you so much, Professor Ochonu. I want to let the audience know that if you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I want to ask one more question. And this has to do with, I mean, as you just said, that people on the ground in the various regions and for sometimes for long duration, are seeking fundamentally just to live their lives, in peace, to thrive, to have futures, to expect progress in the next days, in the next generation, just like anyone else. And at the same time, what is very concerning, I think, is the ways in which
the chat is disabled.
Oh, sorry. Can we get help with the chat and making sure that the chat is enabled?
I think questions can be put in Q&A.
That is correct. They must go in the Q&A.
Thank you, Tiffany. So please put your questions in the Q&A. Thank you. What I was trying to get at is that, this episode, as we've all pointed out, has so many different layers and so many different layers of interest groups, local, regional, international, having to do with land and climate, having to do with resources, having to do with military prowess and demonstration of military prowess, and so on. And what does this do for the characters that we keep coming back to, which is citizens who have to live seemingly as pawns within larger geopolitical and regional and international contests that may or may not have their actual interests at heart. How should we think about these efforts that citizens are engaged in to draw in these larger interests? Are they naive efforts? Are citizens really being strategic and resourceful and using what they have to try to get what they want? Is this a ahistorical approach to problem solving? This is not the first international intervention. I think Professor Okoh's work, we can really think about the British at the time of independence being the first international interveners coming and setting up a political structure for Nigeria going forward. Is this a lack of historical understanding about how these engagements have worked for ordinary people in the past? So how should we think about the interests of our fundamental co-citizens?
I think the first thing is,
citizens.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
The first thing,
yeah, I mean, I feel like the word citizen doesn't really do justice to what I mean, I think we are talking about interest groups, right? And I think the first thing in terms of how to begin to think about these complex issues of sort of relational politics is first, these are not victims. And I feel like in many ways, people have learned over time, over generations, to leverage their interests against certain claims, whether they are ethnic claims, religious claims, various forms of political identity, social identity, in order to access resources, whether it is in terms of political resources or material resources. And so the language of interests and interest group, I think, more aligns with the realities that can enable us to begin to understand, much less begin to think about sort of opportunities and solutions to these seemingly intractable historical problems. So that's something that I would offer.
That we're talking about interest groups really, and not so much
not citizens, exactly.
well, so I think Nigerians know where their shoes are pinching. I wouldn't even say that there are interest groups in the way that scholars like to see interest groups. I see communal groups. I see religious framing interests. I see, a lot of frustrated and frankly embattled people who have tried their best to make overtures, to entreat, to beg, to appeal to the state to do its job, and it's been ignored. So I spent 1 year, 2022 to 2023, in Kuru, which is in the vicinity of Jos. It is highly insecure. This is no way to live life. So people are frustrated, and they know, I think, I see this dynamic of Nigerian people talking to the Nigerian government ignoring them, and then they take it to the international system, and they try to shame the Nigerian government into action. So this is a dynamic that has been going on for a good long time. But I think it's dangerous. I can understand that when you are frustrated and people are being killed in the numbers that they are, you need something to happen. So you don't care whether it is the Chinese or the Americans or the Russians or the Israelis that come and rescue you. You want to be rescued. So I really get that. But it is dangerous, like I said. People may not care about the abstract quality of sovereignty, but it does mean something. And I think if we totally lose sovereignty, this is when ordinary people will now see, so this is what sovereignty means, that the Americans can come and do anything that they want, anytime that they want, to anybody that they want in Nigeria, including, remember the specter of what happened with Venezuela. Capture anybody that they want and come and prosecute them here in the US for anything that they want. This is what the loss of sovereignty means. Now, sovereignty also should mean that we have a state that cares about the integrity of its territorial boundaries, that cares about the well-being of the people, that wants security to be available to everybody, but we don't have that. So people have been talking. They have made all kinds of efforts. They are usually ignored until it gets into the international community. Now, my fear is that we have in the US a Trump administration that does not understand Africa, that does not care about Africa, that has talked all kinds of really vitriolic rhetoric about Africans and Africa. That is not the administration that you trust to come and rescue you. So if there's no trust on the Nigerian side, there should be no trust towards America as it is presently showing us what it is capable to do. Even the allies of the US in NATO are scared now. So I don't think opening the door to America and saying that you can come and do whatever you want is a wise move.
So thank you so much for those remarks. There are a few questions that have come up in the Q&A, and I'm just going to pull them all out, and anyone who feels so moved can answer one of the questions. Okay. The first question is from Faustina. How is it possible that Trump and his administration's focus and involvement on Nigerian affairs, or is it possible that the administration's focus and involvement on Nigerian affairs is being used to distract Americans from domestic issues? So why is the Trump administration interested in Nigeria now? Could it be a ruse to gain resources, assert American dominance, especially after involvement in Iran, Venezuela, and Greenland, etc.? Second question, directed at Professor Ochonu. As someone who grew up and was educated in the North, do you think the rhetoric and guided framing or narratives promoted by a segment of Muslim elites in the North have contributed to this issue and how it has evolved to its current state. Third question. Could you talk about whether or not you see the AES Confederation, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, as one possible pathway forward for other countries in West Africa and beyond? So this is a question about the way forward. This question is about religion, and I'll stop here. Do we see any kind of insignificant difference between Pentecostal versus mainline Protestant Christian reactions to the attacks around northern Nigeria? So do we also want to dehomogenize the Christian voice in Nigeria? And maybe I would just add one of my own. So we started the year 2025 with the rapid and uncoordinated divestment of the US from Nigeria and many other countries through the closing of USAID and through the closing of all kinds of pathways of connection between these countries. And then we ended with the bombing of Nigeria, as well as the banning of Nigerians from the US. So what exactly is the nature of the relationship between Nigeria and the US? How should we really be thinking about it? So those are some of the closing questions that we have from the group. There's others in the chat, and we can send them to you by email.
I'd like to go first. I think I'll answer the question about whether or not the bombings were a distraction from domestic issues. I don't think they were a distraction from the domestic issues. I think they were a message to a domestic audience by the US administration that Christians will be protected no matter where they are. And in essence, it's following on from the agenda that is being set by the current administration, that they will continue to protect certain groups that align with their political affiliation. In essence, but it was also an international message to America's allies and also to their potential enemies as well. Countries who are looking at Africa or Nigeria as a gateway to increase their economic standing and financial standing. And of course, we can't forget that Nigeria has a lot of natural resources that America needs. And the fact that China is in Nigeria and has increased its footprint all across sub-Saharan Africa has been on the radar of America for the last 10 years, since the Belt and Road Initiative that China made public in the late 1990s. So the fact that China is increasing its footprint all across Africa, East and Southeast Asia has put America on the back foot to the point where they feel that they need to intervene to send that message to their potential rival that, in essence, Nigeria should be within the remit of the global North's hands, in essence. But it also probably was on the other hand, maybe a little bit of a distraction to say, well, on Christmas Day, because it was the fact that the bombings were done on Christmas Day, not the day before, not the day after, but specifically on Christmas Day, was meant to send a message domestically. So,
thank you.
There's a question that was directed to me. I do not think, let me give two answers to this question. One is that I feel like the northern Muslim elite, until recently, and I emphasize until recently because the tide has shifted, it seems to me. I have observed that. But until recently, the northern Muslim and political elite hasn't quite decisively and clearly moved to articulate a counterpoint to the ideological positions of groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP and even the bandits. Rather, until recently, there were attempts even to legitimize their grievances, even though their grievances and their interests were vague, were vaguely articulated. For instance, if you ask anyone in northern Nigeria today, what do the bandits actually want? What is the basis of their agitation and criminality and criminal violence? No one can tell you what it is. As for ISWAP and Boko Haram, they want an Islamic theocratic state, which is impossible in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society like Nigeria. It's simply impossible. It's unattainable. But I think that the northern Muslim elite hasn't been quite clear and forceful in pushing back against those ideological narratives by these groups that perpetrate this violence until recently. That said, I think that the tide is shifting and has shifted, and you see more clearly articulated messages, both theological messages and political and ideological counterpoints being raised by the Muslim elites, and that has to be appreciated and acknowledged. Finally, their reaction to the Christian persecution and Christian genocide narrative, I thought was quite appropriate because the construct of Christian genocide and Christian persecution basically erased Muslim victims from the picture and, basically did not acknowledge that there have been hundreds of thousands of Muslim victims. And so the appropriate pushback was to say, look, there have been probably more Muslim victims than there are Christian victims, despite the fact that most of the perpetrators are Muslims. And so I thought that was the right response. In the way that I myself say it is that we may have what is going on, maybe two parallel genocides, right? Going on at the same time. One fact does not cancel out another. You could have Christians being killed in genocidal numbers. You could also have Muslims being killed in genocidal numbers. That's what's happening. And it may be the case that only the Christians, through their different networks and organizational systems and connections, have been complaining about it, to the international people, to the evangelicals, to the Trump administrations, while the Muslim victims haven't quite been doing the same in internationalizing their victimhood or the victimhoods of their kinsmen and women. And so that's what has made the difference in terms of instigating and provoking these international reactions and interventions. But, in terms of their response to the Muslim genocide narrative, absolutely spot on, because you cannot invisibilize a whole group of victims and selectively, just complain about one set of victims. That's just not tenable. That's not even human. It's, we are denying the humanity of the victimhood on the Muslim side. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think even if the Trump administration meant this to be a distraction, it actually didn't factor much into the consciousness, the reportage, or awareness that something, serious happened in Nigeria. And since I'm famous for being shocked, I'm shocked, And also, it is beyond me to understand why people who purport to be Christians would be very pleased about the deliberate targeting and killing of people on Christmas Day. This is shocking to me. And I think there was a question about whether there's difference between the evangelicals and the mainline Christians. I see some difference. I think the most robust connection between among Christians who think of this as a Christian genocide is between the evangelicals of Nigeria and the evangelicals of America. And, you know, this connection between them has been a factor that people kind of remark upon when they think about globalization and the globalization of Christianity. But I can't go into that very much right now. I also see that, you know, when, like I said before, people communicate with their government and the government is unwilling, it makes for desperation of a special sort, except if we want people to be willing to die in place. They have the right to try to find help. The US also found help during its Revolutionary War, you know, against the UK, you know. So this is not abnormal. But what is in question here is about, and I do appreciate the point that Professor Okoh made about the fact that this is not unique to Nigeria. I know that. But, you know, Nigeria concerns me because of its size, the size of the population, because also of its connectedness to all the major power players in Africa, because of also its ambition to be that giant of Africa. I don't think people have forgotten that, you know, even though it is beyond me to see how whatever Nigeria is doing now makes for its progression to giant, you know. So we have a situation where Nigeria is, if America can somehow have Nigeria well captured, it doesn't have any problem with controlling the rest of Africa. Now, the AES states are also there, I think, as an annoyance to the US because of the rhetoric they're propagating about imperialism, about post-colonial control by the colonialists, and the fact that, you know, they're kind of, if you look at social media, it's as if some of these military leaders are the new messiahs. I don't think the US likes that. And, you know, it wants to kind of control that narrative and say these are not good faith actors. Now, the institutions in Africa are also broken. ECOWAS is not acting fit for purpose. AU is not acting fit for purpose in terms of living by their own rules and regulations about what they say about democracy, about human rights, about everything, you know. Mm-hmm. So since we're in a process, let's be kind to what's happening. We're in a process where state making is happening, and it's always a very tumultuous process. There's also international actors that have seen Africa, number one, as labor reserve, number two, as a source of, you know, very valuable raw materials that they can extract at very low cost, and they want to continue this kind of relationship. With the anti-colonial struggle, Africans were fighting back. I think we're now at another inflection point where Africans have to make up their mind that they are not ready to be colonized again, and that we'll take charge of our own fate and make peace with our neighbors instead of opening the door for all kinds of imperialist interests, including the US, to come and control us.
Thank you. I think that is a very excellent note to end our discussion on. And there are so many dimensions, as has already been pointed out, and questions remain in the Q&A. But our panelists, I think, have laid out some of the key issues for us and really helped us to think about, in nuanced ways, about this unfolding history that is being characterized as a story and simply a narrative, but really affects people's real lives and the fates of communities, the fates of nations. And I want to thank you all for giving of your time and your attention to this very complex issue. And I want to thank our audience for their excellent questions and for their attention as well. And I also want to thank my Associate Director, Jenny Price at the Institute for African Studies, for helping to coordinate this panel, the first that the Institute is hosting for this spring semester. And also, I want to thank our student workers at the Institute for all their support with making this Zoom discussion go off without a hitch. Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We continue.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.